In Chapter 6, we're going to focus on three topics that are all linked together. To begin with, we're going to look at DNA synthesis, which is basically producing DNA. We're going to look into a form of cell division known as mitosis, and then we're going to end the chapter by looking at another form of cell division known as meiosis. In this first part of Chapter 6, though, we're going to focus on the first topic here, which is DNA synthesis. And so, at the very beginning of Chapter 6, your text actually begins with a discussion on cancer. You know, cancer is something that at some point in our lives we've all been exposed to, whether we have a loved one that has had cancer, whether we ourselves have had cancer and battled this awful disease. And so, first off, what is cancer? Well, basically, cancer is formed of tumors, and tumors are where you've had unregulated cell division that form a lump of cells that have no function. So what we know about our own cells, and we've already talked about this semester, is that every cell in our body that's a normal human body cell has a specific function. You know, skin cells, or blood cells, or bone cells, they all have a specific function. But one of the things that we know about cancer cells is that they do not take on a function. And so tumors are just where you form this mass of cells that have no function in body activities. And so we have two types of tumors, and again, I'm sure you've heard of these terms before: benign tumors or malignant tumors. Benign tumors, if you had a choice, would be the one that you'd prefer to have, just because they don't affect surrounding tissues. They don't spread. So benign tumor is one that usually is treated by just surgical removal of that mass. A malignant tumor, on the other hand, is more dangerous because it has that ability to invade surrounding tissues. We use the word metastasis, or to metastasize, when we describe a malignant tumor, because these are those that have that ability to move to other areas of the body. So treating these poses a problem, because since they have that ability to spread, it's not just something that you could just surgically remove in one go. A lot of times malignant tumors are going to be treated with chemotherapy and radiation and things like that. So just really quickly, if you look at the image, this is in your textbook on the bottom, page 108, but you can see with cancer, you start out with a normal cell division, but at some point a potentially cancerous cell is formed. It does not take on a function, and then if that cancerous cell goes through unregulated cell division, it can form this tumor. Now, what are some risk factors for cancer? Now, risk factor by definition is any type of behavior, that could be habits, things like that, any type of condition that increases your chances of developing the disease. And so as far as cancer is concerned, there's a lot of information out there as to inheriting cancers. We know that certain cancers are linked to certain genes, and we're going to talk about this in just a second. For example, Angelina Jolie, which I know a celebrity that most of you have probably heard of before, used to be married to Brad Pitt. I think right now they're going through some type of separation or whatever, but she had family members that had a certain type of breast cancer, and through genetic research they have discovered that this particular type of breast cancer that ran in her family was related to a certain mutated gene. And so what Angelina Jolie decided to do several years ago was she went through a genetic testing to discover whether or not she possessed that particular mutated gene and what her risk was of having that gene. And so what they actually discovered was that she was at a very high risk of having that gene, and so because of that, a very high risk for eventually developing that particular type of breast cancer. So what Angelina Jolie decided to do was to go ahead and have a double mastectomy, to have both breasts removed so that she could prevent her having cancer later on. Another celebrity that it mentions at the very beginning of Chapter 6 is Lance Armstrong. Now, I don't know if you know who he is, but Lance Armstrong, he was a cyclist, so he competed riding the bicycle, and so he developed testicular cancer. Of course, they were unsure as to necessarily how he got it, but he was treated with it. They used chemotherapy to treat it, and did some removal there, and he is now cancer-free. So the question at the end of all of this is cancer something that can be passed on? And so what we're going to look at very briefly is that in order to understand that question or to answer that question, we have to have a general understanding of DNA, a general understanding of genes and how those things are replicated in order to understand if cancer can in fact always be something that's passed on. So in section 6.2, this begins in your text on page 110. If you want to flip ahead, you can get to page 110. And these are the learning objectives for this section. So we're going to compare and contrast asexual sexual reproduction. We're going to list the normal functions of cell division. We're going to describe structure and function of chromosomes. We're going to define sister chromatids and centromeres. We're going to outline replication of DNA and a certain enzyme involved in that known as DNA polymerase. We're going to define semi-conservative replication, and then finally at the end of this section we're going to discuss mutations. So first off, types of reproduction. So if we're talking about passing genes and passing chromosomes on to new cells that are made, there's two types of reproduction that are used to do this. First off, asexual reproduction. Now asexual involves only one parent cell, and all offspring that are produced from that parent cell are going to be genetically identical to the parent. So asexual reproduction is used completely by bacteria, by certain protists known as the amoeba. You can see the picture to the right. And there are certain forms of asexual reproduction that are used in humans as well. And we'll talk about mitosis and kind of how that goes on. But again, basic definition of asexual reproduction: one parent cell, and all the offspring will be genetically identical to the parent cell. The other form of reproduction that we see is known as sexual reproduction. Well, sexual reproduction obviously involves combining two parent cells. And in this combination, all the offspring are going to be genetically different because you're involving two parent cells that are different, and so they're going to produce offspring that are different. Now, again, humans use this when we produce sperm cells. We produce egg cells for the purpose of fertilization and producing a zygote, which eventually becomes the baby. Now, why is cell division important? What's the purpose of cell division? Well, obvious purposes why our cells divide is so an organism can grow. If you know anything about a human, we started out as a single-celled zygote, and then very quickly that single-celled zygote went through cell division, and that one cell became two cells became four, and then before you know it, we're made of trillions of cells. So cell division used for growth. But cell division is also used to replace damaged cells. You think about, like the image on the right, if you cut yourself, that cut doesn't stay there as a gaping open wound for the rest of your life. Eventually, your body goes through cell division, and it uses the new cells that are made to replace the damaged cells. And so eventually that wound closes, it heals, and you might have a scar, but you won't have the wound for the rest of your life. And then, of course, the most obvious reason for cell division is to reproduce. We know that without cell division, our bodies don't form gametes, which are the sperm cells or the egg cells, and therefore we would never produce any offspring. So definitely important reasons for cell division. Now, before we get into some different types of cell division like mitosis and meiosis, we first need to come back and take a look at DNA. Now, remember, DNA is our genetic material. So if we're asking the question, can cancer be passed on, then what we're asking is cancer something that's present in our genetic material? And is that genetic material something that can be passed on? So first off, remember DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and DNA carries our genes. And this is the information, the genes, that's actually going to be copied before a cell can be divided, and it's going to be passed on. So the question is, well, what are genes? Well, these are obviously not the denim material that you're wearing, but these genes are sections of DNA, and these sections of DNA carry instructions for building cell proteins. And then it's the cell proteins that carry on all the gene expressions. So basically it's the proteins that carry out who you are and what you are. So DNA, again, this is your genetic information, and genes are sections of the DNA that carry instructions for how to build an organism. Now, we also have to bring up a term, chromosome, because I know you've heard this word before. Chromosomes are made up of DNA, and this DNA is wrapped around certain proteins. Now, in an uncondensed form, the chromosomes actually look like string-like material or thread-like material. We typically call them chromatin. They carry hundreds and hundreds of genes in them. Before cell division, this chromatin, or this string-like DNA, is going to be duplicated. It's going to be attached at a location called the centromere, and we call these sister chromatids. So if you look at the picture, I'm just kind of glancing back, just kind of getting a visual here. So you have all this genetic material. It's grouped together in DNA, and each section, different sections of it are known as genes, and then this DNA is wrapped around proteins to form a chromosome. And each chromosome, you'll notice, starts out as just an individual unduplicated chromosome, but before they can actually divide, the cell can divide, it is copied, held together by something called a centromere, and it forms this duplicated chromosome that we're typically used to seeing, that X-shaped structure, when you hear the term chromosome. Now remember, DNA is a double helix. We talked about before, and we'll talk about again in another chapter. It's made of sugars and phosphates, and then it's made of nitrogen bases held together by hydrogen bonds. Remember, in DNA, the A's go with T, and the G's go with C. And again, we'll look at this more in detail in just a moment. So before a cell can divide, the DNA has to be copied so that when the cell splits in half, you get two cells that have the correct DNA. So first off, the first thing that has to happen in order for DNA to copy itself is it has to split the helix. Remember, we just remind ourselves that DNA is a double helix, or a spiral staircase. And so first thing that has to happen is that helix is going to split in half, straight down the middle, and you notice that that's happening to the right here in the image. And by the way, this picture is found on page 112 of your text. Once the DNA is split in half, right down the middle, then we basically just follow the rule in pairing our bases. So new nucleotides are found, and they're added. All the adenines are paired with thymines. All the guanines are paired with cytosines. And as we add these according to the rule, it will form two new strands of DNA, which gives you two exact copies of each other. Now you'll notice in the picture that this red color denotes the original strand, and this purple color denotes the new strand that's made from it. So we use the term semi-conservative to describe DNA replication, because when you look at a double helix, what you'll actually notice is that half of the double helix is the red color, the original strand. The other half is the purple color, which is the new strand. Semi meaning half. So semi-conservative just says every DNA molecule, half is the original parent strand, the other half is the new daughter strand. Now, one enzyme that we do want to mention when we talk about replication is known as DNA polymerase. Now, we know it's an enzyme because it ends with those three letters ASE, but DNA polymerase is known as the chaperone for replication because it's heavily involved in the copying of DNA. You'll notice that once the DNA is split down the middle, it's actually polymerase, you see this green structure in the background, polymerase that finds the new base pairs, and once it has found them, it pairs them up. So polymerase is helping to oversee this process. It's making sure that things are paired correctly, and then once the replication has occurred, it actually comes back and proofreads to make sure that it has paired all the bases following the rule that all the adenines are with thymines and all the guanines are with cytosines. Now, because DNA polymerase is pairing all these up, and it's also proofreading, sometimes it makes a mistake. And as it makes a mistake, it's going to alter the sequence of the original gene, because instead of an A going with T, you might end up with an A with a G or something like that. So these mistakes in DNA replication can lead to mutations. Now, by definition here, a mutation is just a change in the sequence of DNA. Now, if you think of the word mutation, a lot of us think of, things like X-Men, Wolverines, that kind of stuff. But genetic mutations, again, they're just changes in the DNA sequence. Now, what this change can do is it can change the structure and function of the protein that's actually made. Now, this mutation that changes the protein, it could cause no effect to the organism, meaning mutations can be occurring in your body right now and you actually may not see any effect. But they also can cause mutated tumors to form. and these particularly could be causes of cancer. Now, one of the things that we know about genetic mutations is that they are permanent and that they can be inherited. So when we talk about coming back to this idea of cancer and whether or not cancer can be something that's passed on, if the cancer is caused by a genetic mutation, and genetic mutations can be passed on, well, then you have to consider that cancer is something that could be inherited as well.